Year 782, on a cold grey field by the river Aller. The air is heavy, thick with the damp bite of autumn. Thousands of Saxons kneel in endless rows, hands bound tight, heads bowed. The faint murmur of prayer mixes with the rattle of chains dragged across wet soil. In front of them, blades gleam under a darkening sky. A single command shatters the silence. Steel comes down, again and again. By nightfall, 4,500 lives are gone. The river runs red. The man who ordered it wasn't a nameless tyrant. It was Charlemagne, the so-called father of Europe, a hero to some, a saint to the church. But here's the question: how can the man praised for uniting the West also be the author of one of the bloodiest massacres in the Middle Ages? In this video, we will uncover the buried crimes of King Charlemagne and the day Verden drowned in blood. The world Charlemagne was born into was fractured. Rome was gone, its stone roads and marble cities crumbling under the weight of neglect. What remained of the old empire was scattered into small warring kingdoms, each ruled by chieftains who answered to no one but the edge of a sword. It was the middle of the 8th century. Western Europe was a patchwork of shifting alliances and endless vendettas. To the north, pagan tribes roamed the forests and rivers, their gods older than the memory of Rome. To the south, the Muslim Umayyads had crossed into Iberia and carved out a powerful foothold. Between them, in the heart of the continent, lay the Frankish realms, a kingdom on the rise. Charlemagne was born into this kingdom, into the dynasty known as the Carolingians. The exact year of his birth is uncertain. Historians place it around 742. But what is certain is that from the very beginning his life was shaped by war, politics, and faith. His father, Pepin the Short, was no ordinary noble. He was a man who had overthrown the last Merovingian king, ending a dynasty that had ruled for centuries. Pepin seized the crown not by accident, but through careful alliance with the one power that could legitimize his rule, the Roman Catholic Church. Charlemagne's childhood was steeped in this new political order, a union of the sword and the cross. He grew up in the royal court, a place where warriors dined beside bishops, where political intrigue was whispered in the shadows of chapel walls. Every day he witnessed the delicate balance his father maintained, appeasing nobles who craved more land, satisfying the church that demanded more souls for Christ. But these were not peaceful halls. Even as a boy, Charlemagne was aware of the constant threat of rebellion. Border lords eyed each other with suspicion. Invaders tested the frontiers. Any sign of weakness could bring disaster. Charlemagne's education reflected this world. He was trained to be both a warrior and a Christian ruler. He learned to wield a sword before he could fully read. Yet alongside military drills, he was instructed in Latin, the language of the church and of law. From his earliest lessons, he was told the same truth over and over. The Frankish king ruled by God's will, and it was his sacred duty to defend the faith. But defend in the 8th century did not mean passively holding ground. It meant expansion. It meant converting those who had never bent the knee to Rome. And if they refused, the sword would finish what the sermon could not. Charlemagne grew up seeing this policy in action. Frankish armies clashed with Aquitanians to the southwest, with Bavarians to the east. Victories brought new territories, but also new subjects who often resisted Frankish law and Christian rituals. These campaigns weren't just about land. They were about order, or at least the Carolingian vision of it. An order where all of Western Europe, from the Pyrenees to the North Sea, would be united under one faith and one crown. It was a dream rooted in the ghost of the old Roman Empire, but reimagined through the lens of the Church. And for young Charlemagne, this dream was never abstract. He saw firsthand the spoils of war paraded into the court, gold chalices from conquered churches, prisoners destined for slavery, exotic animals from distant lands. He also saw the price, the widows and orphans left behind when Frankish warriors fell, the burned villages that dotted the contested borders. By the time Charlemagne reached manhood, he had already marched in his father's campaigns. He had seen the battlefield, the mud, the blood, the chaos, and he had seen how quickly victory could be turned into rebellion if not followed by firm, sometimes brutal control. In this era, kings were not distant figures issuing decrees from safety. They rode at the front of their armies, their presence both a command and a symbol. The young prince learned that a ruler who could not inspire fear, and loyalty, would not remain ruler for long. Charlemagne's formative years forged a man who believed in two unshakable principles. First, that unity was worth any price. Second, that God's favour was proven through victory. It was a dangerous combination, the conviction of divine mission and the will to enforce it by force of arms. And as the world around him teetered between faith and war, between chaos and fragile order, Charlemagne stood ready to take the mantle his father had claimed and push the Frankish realm far beyond its borders. What he could not know then was that the same conviction that would make him the most celebrated ruler of his age would also lead him to commit acts that history would remember in blood. When Pepin the Short died in 768, the Frankish kingdom didn't pass neatly to a single heir. In keeping with Frankish custom, the crown was split, not in two halves of land, but in two halves of power. Charlemagne would rule one part of the realm. His younger brother, Carloman, would rule the other. On parchment, it sounded like a balance. In reality, it was a fuse waiting to burn. The brothers were different in temperament and in vision. Charlemagne, already a seasoned warrior, leaned toward expansion. Carloman was more cautious, perhaps even suspicious of his older brother's ambitions. The court split along these lines, each noble calculating which brother's stake might rise higher. For 2 years, this uneasy dual rule limped forward. 2 courts, 2 councils, 2 kings, both sons of the same father, but each with his own allies and ambitions. Charlemagne rode south against rebellious Aquitanians. Carloman stayed home, tending to internal matters. Neither seemed eager to support the other. Then, in 701, everything changed. Carloman fell ill, and within weeks he was dead. No grand battle, no epic duel, just sudden, unexplained death. Some whispered disease, others whispered dagger or poison. History offers no proof, but the timing left no room for a power struggle. Almost overnight, Charlemagne inherited the whole kingdom. No longer half a ruler, he now commanded the entire Frankish realm, from the Pyrenees in the southwest to the edges of Saxon territory in the northeast. He wasted no time. The ink was barely dry on the formalities of succession when Charlemagne began laying the groundwork for what would become one of the most aggressive expansion campaigns of the Middle Ages. His first moves were not with the sword, but with marriage. In the politics of the 8th century, a well-placed wedding could be worth more than a dozen victories. Charlemagne's first marriage bound him to the Lombards, the powerful kingdom in northern Italy. His second, after setting aside the first wife, linked him to the Alemanni. Each match was strategic, a calculated step towards securing borders or isolating potential enemies. But where marriage failed, war followed. Charlemagne's ambitions weren't just territorial. He saw himself as the defender and spreader of Christianity. To him, every border was both a military and a spiritual frontier. If a neighbour refused Frankish overlordship, they weren't simply political rivals, they were obstacle laws to God's will. It was this mix of ambition and faith that would draw him toward the Saxons, a people who had resisted Rome, resisted the Franks, and resisted baptism for centuries. Their land lay to the north and east, a patchwork of thick forests, winding rivers, and fiercely independent tribes. They owed allegiance to no king, bowed to no priest, and followed gods older than any written record. From the moment Charlemagne became sole ruler, Saxony became more than just a neighbour. It became a target. But before turning fully to the Saxons, Charlemagne tested his strength elsewhere. He marched into Italy, seizing Lombard lands when their alliance faltered. He pushed eastward into Bavaria, ensuring no rival could threaten his flank. Each campaign added to his reputation and to the network of territories tied to the Frankish crown. In these early years, Charlemagne refined the system that would become his hallmark, the blending of political power with the religious mandate. When he conquered a land, he didn't just replace its ruler, he replaced its gods. The local elite were expected to convert to Christianity, often publicly and under oath. Churches rose where temples had stood, bishops replaced tribal priests, and if the people resisted, Frankish justice could be swift and final. For many of his contemporaries, this was a sign of strength, a king who could not only win wars but also bring order to unruly frontiers. For those on the receiving end, it was a cultural death sentence. Charlemagne's consolidation of the Frankish kingdom was not without its risks. A single ruler now commanded a vast, diverse population. Christian and pagan, Latin-speaking and Germanic, settled farmers and roaming herders. Holding such a realm together required more than fear, it required constant motion. The king had to be seen, his authority reinforced not by letters sent from a distant court, but by his own presence on horseback, leading his men into the thick of every conflict. By 772, with his borders relatively secure elsewhere, Charlemagne turned his gaze northward. The Saxons had long been a thorn in the side of the Franks. They raided across the border, defying any attempt to subdue them. Worse still, from Charlemagne's point of view, they clung stubbornly to their pagan faith, rejecting every missionary sent into their lands. What happened next would begin a war that lasted decades, a war fought not only for territory, but for the souls and submission of an entire people, and it would set in motion the chain of events that led to the dark, bloody day at Verden. By the year 72, Charlemagne's gaze was fixed firmly on Saxony. It wasn't just another frontier to him, it was an open challenge, a defiant land whose people rejected Frankish rule and, worse in his eyes, rejected Christ. The Saxons were not a single kingdom. They were a network of tribes, Westphalians, Eastphalians, Engrians, bound together by kinship, custom, and their old gods. They lived in scattered villages tucked deep into the forests and river valleys of what is now northern Germany. To the Franks, they were both elusive and infuriating, striking in swift raids, then melting back into the woods before any army could corner them. At the heart of Saxon religion stood a sacred pillar, the Irminsul, a towering wooden column said to connect heaven and earth. It was more than a religious symbol, it was the anchor of Saxon identity. Destroying it would be like tearing the heart from their people. Charlemagne knew this, and he also knew that to break Saxon resistance, he had to break their spirit. So in the summer of 72, he led his armies deep into Saxon territory. The Frankish host was a fearsome sight. Rows of armoured riders, banners of the cross fluttering above them, the sound of iron-shod hooves pounding the earth. When they reached the Irminsul, there was no negotiation, no ceremony, only destruction. The sacred pillar was hacked apart, burned, and its site plundered. This act sent shockwaves through Saxony. It was not only an assault on their gods, it was a declaration of total war. From that moment, Charlemagne's campaigns in the north would no longer be simple raids or punitive expeditions. They would be a relentless effort to erase the old faith and replace it with the cross. To Charlemagne, Christianity was not just a personal belief. It was a political tool, a unifying force for his empire. A Christian subject could be bound by the same moral laws, the same loyalty to the church that crowned the king. A pagan subject could not. This was the core of his policy, conversion at any cost. Frankish law under Charlemagne was blunt. Refuse baptism, lose your property, practice pagan rites, face exile, or death. And these were not idle threats. His armies carried them out with a precision that left little room for mercy. For the Saxons, this was nothing less than cultural annihilation. The destruction of the Irminsul was followed by the burning of villages, the seizure of hostages, and the forced baptism of entire communities. Those who resisted were branded rebels, enemies not just of the Franks, but of God himself. And yet, the Saxons did not submit easily. Time and again, they rose in rebellion. They struck at Frankish garrisons, ambushed supply lines, and even managed to reclaim some of their sacred sites. Each uprising was met with another Frankish campaign, another wave of destruction. To Charlemagne, this was not frustration. It was proof of the righteousness of his cause. The very fact that the Saxons fought so fiercely only convinced him that they needed firmer discipline, harsher laws, and heavier punishment. But there was another dimension to this war, one often left in the shadows. For all his religious rhetoric, Charlemagne's campaigns also served a practical purpose: expansion of power. Conquering Saxony meant controlling vital trade routes, fertile land, and the buffer zone between his empire and the unpredictable tribes of the northeast. Religion and their politics were inseparable in Charlemagne's mind. To convert was to conquer was to save souls and strengthen the empire. By the late 770s, the war in Saxony had already claimed countless lives, but the bloodiest chapter was still to come. It would be sparked not by a calculated campaign, but by vengeance. In 782, a Frankish army marched into the Suntel Mountains to confront a Saxon force. What happened there would ignite a chain reaction. The Saxons ambushed the Franks, slaughtering them and killing two of Charlemagne's most trusted commanders. When word reached the king, it was not a moment for diplomacy, it was a moment for punishment. The logic of the time and of Charlemagne's rule demanded a response so severe that no one would dare challenge him again. And so, in the autumn of that year, he summoned his forces to the town of Verden. Thousands of Saxon prisoners were brought before him, warriors, chieftains, even men accused only of defying baptism. What would follow would become one of the most infamous days in medieval history, a day that would define Charlemagne not just as a builder of empires, but as the author of a massacre. By the time Charlemagne rode into Saxony again in 772, the destruction of the Irminsul was still fresh in the minds of its people. But after the ambush at the Untold Mountains a decade later, the war between Franks and Saxons entered a new merciless phase. The land itself seemed to resist conquest. Thick, tangled forests swallowed the horizon. Marshes sucked at the hooves of Frankish horses. The rivers were winding, treacherous, perfect for ambush. The Saxons knew every bend, every hill, every shadow. They fought not as an army in neat formation, but as scattered packs, striking like wolves, then disappearing into the woods before the Franks could regroup. To Charlemagne, this was not noble resistance, it was rebellion. And rebellion, in his mind, was not just a crime against the crown, it was a crime against God. After Suntel, the Frankish court seethed with outrage. The loss of two high-ranking commanders was more than a military setback, it was a blow to royal authority. Charlemagne had built his image as an invincible leader, God's chosen ruler. To let such an affront pass without crushing retribution would invite further defiance. So he gathered his forces for a campaign unlike any before. This time the objective was not to capture territory or take hostages, it was to send a message, one carved in fear and written in blood. When the Frankish army advanced, they burned villages, seized livestock, and pulled down any remaining pagan shrines they could find. Men were dragged from their homes, their families left weeping in the ash. Some were accused of fighting at Suntel, others were accused simply of refusing baptism. The lines between soldier and civilian, between guilt and innocence, blurred and then vanished. The Saxons struck back when they could, but the Frankish war machine was relentless. It moved like a tightening noose, cutting off escape routes, surrounding pockets of resistance. Prisoners were herded toward the town of Verden, where Charlemagne himself had taken command. The Royal Frankish Annals, the official record of the king's reign, and recount what happened next with a chilling brevity. They note simply that those accused of breaking their oaths and resisting Christianity were executed. The number they give is stark, 4,504. Imagine the scene, a cold autumn morning. The captives kneel in long rows on the open field. Frankish soldiers stand ready, swords drawn, their breath visible in the chill air. Priests murmur prayers nearby as if sanctifying what is about to happen. For hours the executions continue. One by one the Saxons are struck down. The rhythm is mechanical, the purpose absolute. When it is over, the ground is slick, and the River Aller carries more than just water downstream. The message could not have been clearer. Defy the Frankish king and you forfeit your life and your people's future. For Charlemagne, Verden was not an act of madness. It was policy. He believed, or at least claimed to believe, that such brutality would bring lasting peace. Terror would break the Saxon will, and baptism would bind them to the empire. But the effect was the opposite. In the years that followed, Saxon resistance flared again and again. The massacre did not end the war. It deepened it. The killings at Verden became a rallying cry for those who still clung to their gods and their freedom. To the Franks who lived far from the frontier, the news may have been framed differently, as a righteous victory over stubborn pagans. But in Saxony, the memory was carved deep. The name Charlemagne would never be spoken without bitterness. And yet, even as blood dried on the fields of Verden, Charlemagne's ambitions reached beyond Saxony. His armies would march south into Lombard lands, east into the Avar Khaganate, and even into the Iberian Peninsula. Everywhere he went, the sword travelled with the cross. But Saxony was different. It was not just a territory to be taken. It was a land that had to be remade in his image, or destroyed. And for the people who survived Verden, there was no mistaking the cost of that vision. What happened there in 782 remains one of the most brutal single-day killings in medieval Europe. And it raises the question, was this the work of a Christian king defending his realm, or the cold calculation of a ruler who would stop at nothing to enforce his will? That question would haunt Charlemagne's legacy, even as he wore the crown of a unifier and centuries later, the halo of a saint. Autumn, 782. The mist hangs low over the River Aller, curling like smoke through the bare branches. The ground is wet with last night's rain, soft enough to swallow the sound of boots. But in the centre of the field outside Verden, there is no silence. The air hums with the low, restless murmur of thousands of captives. Saxons pulled from villages, battlefields, and hiding places in the woods. They are forced into lines, hundreds upon hundreds, until the rows stretch far enough that the faces at the other end are only blurs in the grey morning light. Some are warriors, others are farmers, hunters, even boys barely old enough to carry a spear. Many wear nothing but rough wool and leather, still damp from the march here. At the far edge of the field, a cluster of mounted riders waits. One man sits taller than the rest. His cloak is trimmed in fur, his armour polished to a dull bronze glow. This is Charlemagne, the king who has come in person to witness what will happen. To him, today is not a battle, it is a sentence carried out. The charges are read by a cleric, his voice barely carrying over the damp wind. Defiance of the Frankish crown, refusal of baptism, violation of oaths sworn before God. The crimes are collective. The punishment will be too. The royal Frankish annals will record it in one line. He had 4,500 Saxons executed. No embellishment, no doubt, just the stark weight of the number. On the field, the process begins. Frankish soldiers, armoured, expressionless, step forward, their swords already drawn. They work in pairs, one to hold, one to strike. The captives are forced to kneel, their hands bound. The first blade falls. The sound is not the clash of battle, but a single heavy thunk, then another and another. The rhythm takes hold, spreading down the lines like a grim drumbeat. It does not happen all at once. It cannot. There are too many. The executions stretch into hours, the mist slowly lifting to reveal a sky the colour of iron. Crows gather in the nearby trees, their calls sharp and impatient. Some captives stare straight ahead, their jaws clenched, refusing to give the soldiers the satisfaction of fear. Others weep or pray to gods the Franks have condemned as false. One young man shouts a final oath in his native tongue before the blade silences him. There is no mercy here, no last words beyond what the guards allow. The work is methodical, efficient. The Frankish king watches, speaking rarely, his eyes fixed on the unfolding punishment. By midday the ground is slick. The soldiers pause only to wipe their blades, then continue. Bodies are dragged aside to make room for the next line. The pile grows, a silent monument to the king's decree. For the Saxons, this is not just a loss of life. It is a loss of leaders, fathers, brothers, the very core of their resistance. For the Franks, it is a warning delivered in the most unmistakable language of the age. Defy us, and you will be erased. When the final sword stroke falls, the field is quiet except for the shuffle of boots and the distant rush of the river. The smell of blood is thick enough to taste. Priests move among the bodies, murmuring prayers in Latin, claiming the act as justice in the eyes of God. Charlemagne turns his horse towards a camp. Behind him, the survivors, women, children, and the elderly, are driven away under guard, their future uncertain. Ahead of him lies the road back to his empire's heartlands, where this day will be framed not as a massacre, but as a victory. But Verden will not fade from memory, not for the Saxons who will tell the story in hushed, furious tones, not for the Franks who witnessed the scale of what their king commanded, and not for history, which will struggle for centuries to decide. Was this the decisive blow that brought unity, or was it the day that stained Charlemagne's crown forever? In the years to come, the war with the Saxons will rage on. But this single day, one cold grey day by the Aller, will stand apart. Because on that day the cross and the sword were not separate, they were one, and the man who wielded them would be remembered both as the father of Europe and as the king who ordered 4,500 heads to fall. The executions at Verden were meant to be final, a decisive end to Saxon defiance. But in the months that followed, the blood spilled on that field seeped far beyond the banks of the River Aller. News travelled differently in the 8th century. There were no broadsheets, no letters to the editor, only word of mouth, carried by merchants, pilgrims, deserters, and wandering clergy. Yet even in this slower age, the story of Verden spread with startling speed. In the markets of Lombardy, traders spoke of the Frankish king who cut down thousands in a single day. In the courts of Bavaria, envoys whispered about the cost of resisting him. and in the monasteries along the Rhine, scribes copied the royal annals noting the number of 400 without whole comment, as if the sheer scale needed no further explanation. For Charlemagne, this was part of the strategy. The massacre was not hidden. It was a message, a warning dressed in the language of justice. To his allies, it was proof of his strength. To his enemies, it was a vision of what awaited them, yet fear is a double-edged sword. While it could break the will of some, it could also harden the resolve of others. In Saxony, far from quelling rebellion, Verden became a rallying point. Fathers told their sons of the day the Franks killed their chiefs. Warriors swore oaths over the graves of the dead, and every surviving pagan priest carried the story into new villages, turning grief into fury. Charlemagne pressed on. The same year as Verden, his armies turned south into Lombard territory, seizing more cities and tightening Frankish control over northern Italy. From there, he pushed eastward, confronting the Avars, a nomadic people whose fortress rings in the Danube basin were filled with plunder. Each campaign carried the same dual purpose: expand the empire and expand the faith. But the brutality was not confined to Saxony. In Lombardy, Frankish troops dismantled fortifications, stripped treasuries, and sent captives north as slaves. In Avar lands, their war camps were looted, their leaders killed or driven into exile. Even in the Iberian Peninsula, where Charlemagne sought to push back Muslim control, his passage left cities burned, including Pamplona, whose Basque inhabitants would later strike back at Roncesvalles. In every theatre of war, the pattern was the same. Conquest came with a sermon. The cross was planted in newly taken soil, and behind it the sword waited for those who refused to kneel. From the perspective of the Frankish court, this was a righteous mission, the forging of a Christian empire from the chaos of post-Roman Europe. But from the perspective of those on the receiving end, it was something else entirely: forced submission under the banner of faith. The tension between these two views is what makes Charlemagne's reign so hard to define. To the church, he was Pater Europae, the father of Europe, the man who restored learning, law, and Christian unity. To the Saxons, the Basques, the Lombards, he was a conqueror who left ashes in his wake. Even within his own empire, whispers of discontent grew. Some Frankish nobles questioned the cost of endless campaigning. Armies had to be fed, equipped, paid, fields went untilled, while their men marched to distant wars. And although spoils flowed back into the heartlands, so too did widows and fatherless children. Still, Charlemagne did not slow. Each success reinforced his belief that God's favour rested on his sword. Every victory was proof that his cause was just, and every act of resistance in his mind was further evidence that the stubborn had to be broken. By the early 780s, his empire was the largest in Western Europe since the fall of Rome, but it was held together not by shared identity or mutual consent. It was held together by the weight of his armies and the fear of what happened at places like Verden. That fear had a long reach. It reached into the Alps, where Lombard nobles calculated whether loyalty or rebellion would keep them alive. It reached into the forests of Saxony, where hidden warbands still plotted ambushes. It reached into the Basque hills, where resentment simmered after Pamplona's destruction. The shadow of Verden became part of Charlemagne's legend, and his problem. For some, it was proof of his greatness. For others, it was the sign of a king who ruled not through justice, but through the axe. History would one day struggle to decide which version was true, but in 782, there was no question. For those who saw the smoke of burning villages, who heard the clash of iron and the cries of the dying, the message was clear. This was a king who believed peace could be built on the ruins of resistance, and the man who believed that was far from finished. History likes its heroes simple. Saints are saints, villains are villains, but Charlemagne refuses to fit neatly into either mould. In the centuries since his reign, his name has been draped in honorifics: Pater Europae, the father of Europe, the first Holy Roman Emperor, a patron of learning, of law, of faith. But peel back the gilded surface, and another image emerges: a ruler who bound his empire together with iron chains as much as with ideals. A man who saw the spread of Christianity not as an act of mercy, but as a tool for control. And a king who was willing, even eager, to use mass killing as a form of persuasion. The massacre at Verden is the clearest window into this duality. For his supporters, it was the enforcement of law, the punishment of oath-breakers and rebels. In the worldview of the 8th century, kings did not turn the other cheek. They struck back, hard. And to Charlemagne, the Saxons had not just defied him, they had defied God. But the way the punishment was carried out, in one day, in one place, on such a staggering scale, pushes it beyond the norms of even that brutal age. There were other ways to enforce loyalty: hostage-taking, exile, tribute. Charlemagne chose none of them. Instead, he made a spectacle. Why? Part of the answer lies in religion. The Frankish church, deeply intertwined with the crown, believed in the righteousness of forced conversion. To save a soul, they reasoned, was worth any cost. And if terror brought people to the baptismal font, so be it. But there is also the cold arithmetic of politics. The Saxons were not a single centralized kingdom. They were a web of tribes, and their unity came from shared faith and shared enemies. By killing thousands of their leaders and warriors in one sweep, Charlemagne could shatter that web, leaving the survivors too scattered and leaderless to resist effectively. It is here that the two sides of Charlemagne's persona corpteo, the devout Christian ruler and the calculating warlord, become indistinguishable, the Bible in one hand, the sword in the other, each justifying the actions of the other. This blend of piety and pragmatism is what made him so effective and so dangerous. To his followers, every victory was proof of God's blessing. To his enemies, every defeat was a reminder that the Frankish god came with an army. And yet, despite the bloodshed, Charlemagne was also a builder. He reformed laws, standardized weights and measures, and sponsored the revival of learning known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Monasteries flourished under his patronage. Manuscripts were copied, preserved, illuminated. Latin was polished and standardized, becoming the language of administration and scholarship for centuries to come. These are not the acts of a mere butcher. They are the acts of a ruler with a vision, one who believed that uniting Europe under a single faith and a single law would create stability after centuries of chaos. But stability for Charlemagne was never voluntary, it was enforced. And that is the contradiction at the heart of his reign. The man who gave Europe its first taste of unity since Rome also gave it some of its most brutal examples of what that unity would cost. Modern historians continue to debate Verden. Some argue that the Royal Frankish Annals exaggerated the number, that perhaps it was a mistranslation, and the Saxons were merely deported, not executed. Others insist the massacre happened exactly as recorded. The truth may never be settled beyond doubt, but perhaps the more important question is not whether the number was 4,000 or 2,000 or something else entirely. It's whether the act itself, however large or small, represents a moment when the ideals of faith and the machinery of power became inseparable. A moment when the sword and the cross stopped being two different instruments and became one. The church would canonize Charlemagne centuries later in 1165. To the faithful he was a saintly king, a defender of Christendom. But to the descendants of the Saxons, his sainthood was an insult carved over the memory of their dead. This tension between the glorious image and the blood-stained reality is why Charlemagne's name still provokes debate more than 1,000 years later. Was he the man who saved Europe from fragmentation, or the man who showed how unity can be forged in fear? The answer may be both, and that perhaps is what makes him so haunting, because if one man can be both builder and destroyer, saint and executioner, then maybe history's other heroes deserve a closer look. By the early 9th century, Charlemagne stood at the height of his power. From the Atlantic coast to the edge of the Slavic lands, from the North Sea to the mountains of Italy, his banners flew. No ruler in Western Europe had commanded such a vast realm since the days of the Roman emperors. In 800, in the Grand Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a golden crown upon his head. Charlemagne became Imperator Romanorum, Emperor of the Romans. The moment was meant to echo the glories of the Caesars, but clothed in Christian authority. It was the perfect fusion of crown and cross, of earthly power and divine sanction. And yet, even as he basked in this imperial glory, cracks were beginning to form. The unities he had forged was held together by his presence, his relentless travel, his personal oversight, his constant campaigns. Without him in the saddle, the ties between far-flung territories would loosen. In his final years, Charlemagne slowed. The warrior who had once ridden at the head of his armies now walked with stiffness, his frame thickened by age. He spent more time in Aachen, the city he had built into his imperial capital. There he surrounded himself with scholars, bishops and trusted nobles, continuing to refine laws, issue decrees, and oversee the administration of his vast empire. But the wars had taken their toll. Decades of campaigning meant decades of blood and resentment stored in the memories of the conquered. In Saxony, rebellion still simmered, flaring up whenever Frankish troops thinned their presence. In the Basque lands, the wound of Roncesvalles was not forgotten, and in the east, the restless frontier with the Slavs and Avars remained unstable. Charlemagne's final act as emperor was not a battle, but a choice. Who would inherit this enormous, fragile creation? By then, most of his sons had died. Only Louis the Pious remained, a devout, mild-mannered man whose nature was nothing like his father's. In 813, Charlemagne crowned Louis as co-emperor. It was an act meant to ensure a smooth transition, but it also acknowledged the reality that his own time was nearly over. On January 28, 814, after more than 4 decades on the throne, Charlemagne died in Aachen. He was buried in the cathedral he had built there, in a tomb that would become a place of pilgrimage for centuries. The empire he left to Louis was still the greatest in Europe, but it was also brittle. Louis inherited not just the crown, but the deep divisions and resentments that had been forced under the surface by Charlemagne's will. Within a generation, the cracks widened. Louis's sons turned on one another, plunging the empire into civil war. By the middle of the 9th century, the once united realm was fractured into 3 kingdoms, the seeds of what would become France, Germany, and Italy. Charlemagne's dream of a unified Christian Europe had lasted barely longer than his own lifetime. The borders shifted, the alliances faded, but the memories remained, and they were not the same everywhere. In the Frankish heartlands, he was remembered as the great king, the lawgiver, the protector of the church. In Rome, he was the emperor who restored the idea of Western Christendom, but in Saxony in the north his name was a shadow over the past, the man who had tried to erase their gods and their freedom in a single lifetime. And then came the most extraordinary turn of all. In 1165, 3.5 centuries after his death, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa sought to strengthen his own rule by linking it to Charlemagne's legacy. With the backing of an anti-pope, Charlemagne was canonized, declared a saint. For many in the church, this was a celebration of his role in spreading Christianity. But for others, it was a bitter irony. To sanctify the man who had ordered the slaughter at Verden was to place a halo over one of the bloodiest acts in medieval history. The judgment of history remains divided. To some, Charlemagne is still the father of Europe, the visionary who brought order to a continent in chaos. To others, he is the conqueror who proved that unity can be achieved by the sword, but only for a time. Perhaps the truest verdict lies in the ruins and records he left behind. An empire built on faith and force, learning and fear, unity and blood. A reminder that even the grandest legacies are written in shades of light and shadow, and in that shadow, on a grey autumn field by the River Aller, lie the ghosts of 400 Saxons, still waiting for their story to be told. History rarely speaks with one voice. The same figure can wear a crown in one tale and a shroud in another. And few rulers embody this more than Charlemagne. In France, his name became a banner of pride. Medieval poets sang of him in the Chanson de Geste, epic songs of knights, crusades, and the defense of Christendom. In these stories, he was the wise king, the warrior of God, the father of chivalry. Generations of French rulers traced their authority to him, calling themselves heirs to his empire. In Italy, especially in the Papal States, Charlemagne was remembered as the protector of the church, the man who knelt before the Pope and revived the Roman imperial title. In cathedrals and illuminated manuscripts, his image was one of solemn piety, often shown with a golden crown and a halo of divine favour. But travel north into Saxony and the story changed. There, Charlemagne's name was carried not in songs, but in warnings. For centuries after Verden, folk memory kept the wound alive. Elders told children of the day their ancestors were herded onto a field and cut down. In some villages, old sites were whispered about as cursed ground not to be disturbed, for fear of awakening restless spirits. To the Saxons, Charlemagne was not the father of Europe. He was the butcher who had tried to erase their gods, their customs, and their freedom. Even centuries later, as Christianity took firm root in the region, the resentment lingered beneath the surface, a reminder that the faith had arrived not as a gift, but as a demand. This divide in memory persisted into the modern era. In the 9th century, as nationalism swept across Europe, Charlemagne's image was reshaped again. French historians claimed him as a symbol of French unity. German scholars, especially those in Prussia, insisted he was a German hero, the first true ruler of the German lands. Each side polished away the inconvenient truths, focusing on the victories, the reforms, the vision of empire. But in Saxony, a counter-narrative emerged. Some nationalist thinkers there revived the story of Verden as proof of Frankish, and by extension French, aggression against the Germanic peoples. Charlemagne became, in their telling, a foreign oppressor, a warning against outside domination. The church, for its part, held firmly to his sainthood. In Aachen, pilgrims still visited his tomb, praying for intercession, venerating relics linked to his reign. The cathedral, with its soaring arches and golden shrine, radiated the image of a ruler touched by God's grace. And yet, outside those walls, historians continued to dig into the records, the archaeology, the oral traditions. The debate over Verden never faded. Was it truly 400-500 in a single day? Was it execution or exile mistranslated? Or was the number inflated by later chroniclers, eager to portray the king as a bringer of decisive justice? Whatever the truth, the fact remained. Charlemagne's legacy was not one legacy, but many, and they were often at odds. In France, he was a golden age incarnate. In Italy, a saint. In Saxony, a shadow. That shadow stretched far beyond the Middle Ages. In the 20th century, both the Nazis and the Allies had tried to claim him in their propaganda, one side as a Germanic unifier, the other as a proto-European who transcended borders. The irony was sharp. Both sides ignored the parts of his story that did not fit their needs. But for the people who still remembered Verden, for the descendants of those Saxon tribes, no amount of political spin could erase the sense of loss. To them, Charlemagne's crown would always be edged with blood, and perhaps that is the truest measure of his reign. 1,000 years later, his name could still inspire pride and devotion in some, and bitterness and defiance in others. A ruler whose legacy refuses to be settled. The long shadow of the headsman at Verden still lies across Europe, a reminder that one man's unity can be another man's ruin. Charlemagne's story does not end in 814, or in the fading embers of his empire a generation later. It lives on in the way we remember power, and in the way we forget its cost. We like to believe that greatness can be clean, that a leader can unite without breaking, can build without destroying, can lift a people without crushing another. But history over and over tells us otherwise. Charlemagne is a perfect paradox. He was the architect of an empire that shaped Europe for centuries, and the commander of one of the bloodiest single days in medieval history. He nurtured learning and culture, and extinguished entire traditions under the blade. He stood as a champion of the church, and yet wielded the faith like a weapon in war. The massacre at Verden forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. Is unity forged by fear really unity at all? The Frankish Empire did not survive because its people loved the idea of belonging together. It survived, for a time, because they feared what would happen if they didn't. And when that fear faded, the empire fell apart. That, to me, is the most telling part of his legacy. Not the crown in Rome, not the golden shrine in Aachen, but the silence of the fields where the heads fell. Silence that lasted until rebellion rose again. Silence that tells us no victory built on terror is ever permanent. Perhaps that is why his memory splits so cleanly down the map of Europe. In some places the halo still gleams, in others the shadow still lingers, and in that split we see the truth. The same man can be both a saviour and a destroyer, depending on which side of the sword you stood. In the end, Charlemagne's reign is not just a medieval story, it is a mirror held up to every age, including our own. It warns us that when leaders mix absolute power with absolute certainty, they can convince themselves that cruelty is justice, and that the people who suffer are somehow better for it. And maybe, centuries from now, our own great leaders will be remembered with the same split vision. Hero in some eyes, villain in others. The question is, when that time comes, which memory will last longer? The one carved in marble, or the one carved in bone? I tell these stories because history is never just the past. It's the shadow we walk in every day, the echo behind every speech, the caution buried in every monument. And if we forget that, we risk walking into the same trap in thinking that unity is worth any price. If you believe history should be told without the polish, without the myth, without the mask, then join me. Subscribe to the Nameless Scribe, where we uncover the truths that monuments won't tell you and give voice to the past that power tried to bury. Because every empire leaves behind two legacies, the one it wanted you to remember and the one it hoped you'd forget.